Hello and welcome to the second session of the BioConference Live Advanced Genomics in Clinical and Translational Research. My name is Thomas McElroy and I will be your moderator for this session. On behalf of Life Technologies, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Green. George is Group Director in Bristol Myers Squibb's Center for Pharmacodiagnostics. Today, George will be presenting on managing pharma diagnostic partnerships and companion diagnostic development. And I've had the pleasure to work with George in the past, and so I know he has a lot of experience in facilitating these kind of diagnostic co-development programs within BMS. So this should be a very interesting and informative presentation. At the end of George's presentation, we will go through a little bit of Q&A, so please feel free to submit any questions you have during the presentation. And with that, George, please take it away.
So thank you, Thomas, and welcome everybody to today's discussion. The companion diagnostics field has undergone a lot of evolution over the last several years, and I think I see it evolving from a one-off program, fire drill activity, into more of a strategic focus where programs are viewed on a broader basis. And however, I still think that at many of the meetings today, we see examples of a single companion diagnostic program, and I think we've learned from those, but I think it's time now for the field to start looking at the broader basis for how we're going to develop companion diagnostic products. So today I'd like to go through some of the thoughts we have on how we develop companion diagnostic products and some of the approaches we take to relationships that are extremely complex but are required for the development of these companion diagnostic products. Just one note as I go through this, there's a couple of slides as I get farther into the presentation that have some rather small text on it. It may be better if you're not viewing this in large screen to use large screen when I get to those slides. So just a disclaimer, much of what I'm talking about today is based on my experiences in the field of companion diagnostics, which spans a couple of companies and a number of years. I'm not necessarily speaking of specific policies within Bristol Myers Squibb. Also, this is a kind of broad discussion, and it's really intended to generate ideas and thoughts for people who are going to be approaching a companion diagnostics program, but not really a specific process for that approach. I think each individual program, if I've learned anything in the field of companion diagnostics, every program is unique. There's principles that apply, but there's not really a specific process that can be applied to any one program without significant modifications. So it's really use what I'm talking about today as some guidance, but not necessarily a defined process. So what is a challenge in companion diagnostics development today? One of the large challenges is the differences between the drug and the diagnostic fields. There's many disparate challenges because the drug companies and diagnostic companies have very different priorities. Pharmaceutical companies are very focused on getting their drug to market on time. There's significant financial and market advantages to being first to market or sooner to market. And of course, they're not looking for any limitations on the indication for use for the drug. So actually, a companion diagnostic product tends to limit the market for a drug, and so it has to have a significant advantage in the use of that drug to even be worth including in the program. But you know, as everybody knows, as the field of medicine evolves, personalized medicine provides both challenges and opportunities in the treatment of patients. So more and more drugs will have companion diagnostic products associated with them. That's the paradigm now. Another significant challenge is alignment with the schedule for approval of a drug. It's frequently been discussed how the development of a biomarker tends to lag behind the development of the drug because clinical studies with the drug are frequently required to either identify or validate that the biomarker is effective. And by the time that work is done, the drug is moving typically into late phase 2 or phase 3 trials, and the diagnostic is essentially needed immediately. And of course, development of diagnostic products does take time. There's several years of work very frequently is required. On the other hand, a diagnostic company, because of their challenges with profitability, smaller margins, they need to make sure that they've limited their risk exposure in their portfolio. Making a significant investment in a diagnostic product, which then perhaps might not move forward because of issues with the drug or because of it's not needed with the drug, is just not acceptable to a diagnostic company. They don't have that kind of funding to take those kinds of risks. In addition, many companion diagnostic products have a fairly limited market in the context of what a diagnostic program usually delivers. Especially in oncology, it may be just a few thousands of patients per year. So profitability is always a challenge for diagnostic products like this. Reimbursement is not that great for diagnostic products. And even if the development of the diagnostic is subsidized or paid for entirely by the pharmaceutical company, ongoing, just covering the costs of delivering that diagnostic product can be challenging. And of course, diagnostic companies have a completely different set of regulations that they have to follow. They are somewhat aligned with drug development, or at least they have parallels with drug development. But those regulatory requirements do create challenges to stay aligned with the drug development program and have everything coordinated when the approvals come through. So there's a lot of stressors on these programs, and sometimes there's conflict in the priorities of the programs, especially when I speak of things like market and profitability. And these things need to be aligned for the companion diagnostic program to have a chance of success. And I think many programs today have seen these challenges, and several have overcome them very successfully. So there's a number of customers to the companion diagnostics process, and I have some of the large ones outlined here. I've talked about the pharmaceutical companies and diagnostic companies. Just starting with diagnostic companies, I think they're learning now about the companion diagnostic field. Many of them have a lot of experience now with what the guidelines are. Not as many have practical experience with driving a diagnostic product all the way through the process. But there is a lot of interest in what the opportunities are in the companion diagnostic field. Many diagnostics today have become commoditized. And so the field of companion diagnostics is an opportunity for some novel diagnostics come through with perhaps the chance of expanded markets or profitability if managed properly. Pharmaceutical companies, in general, 3-4 years ago, I would have said pharmaceutical companies in general really don't understand the diagnostic process. I think that knowledge is expanding within pharma companies at different speeds within different companies, but clearly it's going to be understood in the long term. Most, if not all, pharmaceutical companies are now very committed to targeted medicine or personalized medicine. If you look within the organizations, though, I think some areas are less committed than others, and I think some areas don't understand them as well as others. I think there's an understanding within pharma now that diagnostic programs are not going to occur on their own, and that there does need to be some sort of approach of subsidizing the diagnostic companies in these activities. And I think there's been a lot of progress made in that area, and I think diagnostic companies are starting to appreciate that that's going to be the approach. Within these companies, though, within diagnostic and pharmaceutical companies, there's also the development teams, and sometimes development teams have cultures that are different or very well aligned with the overall company, but these teams have their own priorities. Many times, on the diagnostic side, they're very challenged with regard to budget, timeline, obtaining resources, many other challenges that just generally exist within the diagnostic industry. They also, within teams, may have different levels of experience with pharmaceutical companies, and I think that's something that again is evolving, and there's a lot of learning going on in this. A significant challenge that is only sometimes discussed is the quality of the biomarker that's being presented. And this is probably could be the subject of a whole other discussion, or has been the subject of other discussions, but actually demonstrating the biomarker is effective is very different than identifying the biomarker. And many times, in my experience, there's been a biomarker identified, but without adequate evidence that it's going to become a good diagnostic product. And so that's a significant challenge to the development teams on the diagnostic side. On the drug development side, these development teams typically have very limited experience with diagnostic development. There's only a few drug development teams that have had that challenge so far. They tend to be apprehensive about getting involved. They worry about the commercial implications. They worry about the regulatory challenges. And typically they're, as I say here, they're very unclear about what expectations they should have of the diagnostic development process. There's a lot of education that's necessary within the drug development teams to make sure that they can work with the diagnostic program and effectively work to develop a companion diagnostic. Externally, of course, we have the regulatory bodies. They've moved very far in the last 5 to 10 years. There's guidelines now issued. They have approaches to approvals for diagnostic tests. And I think they are definitely beginning to issue those approvals, although it's not as broad as I would like at this point. But they clearly understand how important personalized medicine will be in the future. And then we have the actual customers of the companion diagnostic or the co-developed product, including patients who are starting to become knowledgeable about personalized medicine, physicians who are clearly interested but also challenged by it, and payers who believe that it has benefits but also are challenged by the high cost of the drugs that typically come with companion diagnostics and how to pay for the diagnostic products themselves. So it's a very, very complex picture and a lot of different influences on the development team that's developing a companion diagnostic program. So, and as I've alluded to, there's a lot of players that are involved in a development program, and the simplified version of this, you have a pharma company and a diagnostics company, and within that company, you have the drug development team, and you usually have some sort of a diagnostic development organization working within the pharma company. On the diagnostic side, you have your typical diagnostic development organization, R&D, commercial, business development, various other organizations involved in the development of a companion or any diagnostic product. And then on the pharma side, as I mentioned, you have your diagnostic development team. And this may include a broad array of different participants, again, involving your business development organization, your clinical regulatory organization. Clearly, there's assay development influences, the biomarker team that identified or developed the biomarker. And even within those organizations, you have to tap into other functions of the pharma company to participate and develop the companion diagnostic product. Having access to data from the clinical studies requires your statistics organization or some sort of data organization. You may need to transfer test methods out of your analytical services development program. So there's many, many organizations that get involved. And then on the diagnostic side, of course, the diagnostic company has to create a full diagnostic development team with participation from regulatory, clinical, operations, assay development. And within assay development, you have to remember that you have various functions developing that product. It's really a system that you're developing, not just the reagents in a kit, but you're working with a platform, you're working with analytical methods, you're working with the manufacturing process of many, many different organizations that actually get involved in assay development. And then finally, there is a platform involved. And so you may have a full systems development team, including hardware and software. And actually, the situation is frequently much more complex because you may not have just one pharmaceutical company involved. There may be all the organizations and representation from a second pharmaceutical company. Many of these companion diagnostic products end up being partnered because of the complexity of the drug development program. And in addition, of course, as I mentioned, you have your diagnostic program and all the various organizations within your diagnostics company. However, it's not infrequent that the diagnostic company has to go externally and work with a raw material supplier for critical raw materials, such as antibodies or recombinant antigens, any sort of primers, probes, any sort of raw material that comes from an external source. They become essentially a partner in the process. These critical raw materials are very important to the success of the program. And it's not infrequent that the platform itself comes from a different manufacturer than the diagnostic reagent company. They bring in, or they work on a platform that's already existing that has its approvals, so that it's facilitates a better process to get approvals from the regulatory bodies. So this complex picture really creates a lot of challenges in communicating, in managing priorities, in obtaining alignment on strategy. And so these challenges are what I'd really like to speak of in the next portion of the discussion. So what are some of the significant challenges that we can identify? Well, of course, there's alignment of the goals between the various organizations, not even between the drug and diagnostic company, but between all the different organizations within those companies, as well as the larger picture between the companies. There needs to be clear governance in order to manage all these issues. And I think it's critical, and every successful team I've worked on so far takes the philosophy that the actual working groups need to be very flexible, they need to be very empowered and capable of working their strategy and reacting to situations quickly and effectively. Having a rigid management structure in place really creates barriers because of all the different stakeholders in the process. So it's really about empowerment of the team. Project management is, of course, an essential tool to any development program. It needs to be functioning. I make the comment that it really should be in the background and just make sure that everything is enabled to be effective. And of course, finally, communication is essential, and I think very, very essential is having mutual respect and knowledge of the different capabilities within the different organizations. And I think that's really has become a key factor in building teams among these broad partnerships. Okay, the whole partnering process starts with the contract. The contract is an important element of the program because it does define the relationship, the legal issues, the cost issues, logistical things. But we found it's very important not to turn the contract into a project plan. A couple reasons for that. First is you really don't know what you're developing. You really don't know what the program is, the details of the program is, until you've started to put together a more detailed plan. And the contract's not the place to do that work. Second, as a program evolves, it's very rare that the strategy that you initially decide on holds all the way through the program. There's always change, and if it's in the contract, it makes change much more difficult. So it's very important to look at the contract as defining the broad issues, but not specifics. And a few points I put in here about what are, I think, important to put into the contract. Clearly, the high-level program goals and the schedule for significant milestones, that creates the alignment between the drug and the diagnostic development programs. Having a clear governance framework, high-level governance framework to deal with issues and things like that. Division of responsibilities between the organizations. Frequently, drug companies like to say, we've contracted with somebody to develop a program, tend to throw it over the fence and hope that they don't have to have a lot more involvement. And that's not the case. I think the pharma companies really need to be integrally involved in the development of the diagnostic product as it progresses. And of course, how is change managed in the program? But as I mentioned, details really should be worked out at a lower level. There should be many working teams, and these working teams should be able to refine the plan, put some more detail behind the goals, and develop a scope of the program as they start to execute it. And as I mentioned, the detailed project plans probably aren't a good idea in the contract. To begin the process of having an effective partnership, a good place to start is to define your goals and scope for the program in a little bit more detail than is in the contract. And developing a charter or something of that sort is usually an effective way to bring the teams together and gain that alignment. It's as important to define what's in scope as it is to define what's out of scope. And very frequently, scope creep is a challenge to these development programs. And again, the contract usually defines what the milestones are at a high level, but to put some more detail in that, I think is a very important activity. So bringing the team together in the beginning of the program is a very effective way, or using the goals and scope is a very effective way to bring the teams together and establish these relationships. Okay. Another important thing to consider is making sure that both organizations or all organizations involved understand the processes that have to be followed, and especially the regulatory requirements that are being followed for the different programs. And I list here just a few of the different regulatory bodies that exist. Within the FDA, there's different organizations that review drugs versus reviewing diagnostic products. The two organizations do get together and work together when you have a co-developed product, but there's challenges to making sure that they stay aligned. And then outside of the U.S., there's many other organizations, and their requirements need to be considered. And for the drug development process, well, it goes through the same flow of discovery through feasibility, through development, through clinical studies. The process steps are different, and the alignments aren't necessarily the same. And regulatory considerations within those may differ, and there always has to be an open discussion and a continuous discussion about when a regulatory requirement needs to be addressed. Okay. Another effective way for the teams to come together and gain alignment is to work to develop a intended use for the diagnostic product that's jointly acceptable. Frequently, the drug company will have a general picture of what they want their intended use to be, but when you start to ask questions around what the specific target population is, how the diagnostic will be used, the timing of it, who's going to use the information from the diagnostic product, it generates a very effective discussion between the organizations on what is exactly the product going to look like. And the development of these high-level requirements, starting with the intended use, are a very effective way for the teams to get together and to build the relationships they need to move forward. It also really drives what the product development plan will be, and starts to pick up on some of the details that are needed. You can see some of the influences on the intended use for the product. On the pharma side, you start to talk about what, strategically what's needed for the drug, the medical need, things like that. On the diagnostic side, the drivers tend to be around the strategy for the platform, what sorts of resources, what sort of development capabilities they have within the diagnostic company, because that limits what can and can't be done. And of course, then the alignment really is on the intended use, but also drives what the design input requirements are, as well as your overall program plan. So you get a lot of information from this one set of discussions. All right. Speaking a little bit about governance. Governance is a very important aspect of the development program. If the development program is run effectively, these governance bodies really shouldn't have a very big role, because at the working team level, all these issues should be resolved. But it's important to have these for communication purposes, and also to ensure that stakeholders are engaged with the program, and that the program continues to meet their needs as it moves forward. So typically, there needs to be some sort of an executive level governance body, like a joint executive committee, who has a function to really endorse what the strategy is, and to endorse significant changes in the program, deal with high-level issues, but not really deal with anything on a detailed level at all. A development team, and this is not the working team where it's everybody involved in the development program, but it's really the leadership of the development team, which is responsible for development of the program strategy, managing the program, managing the resources, and also managing the budget. Critical to make sure that there's oversight over this, so that all the stakeholders get what they're looking for out of the program. and also to get endorsement of some of the strategic issues around the clinical regulatory strategy, the development plan, the compliance issues, number of other programs where working teams need to have some sort of forum to have discussions and get endorsement of those issues. And then finally, there needs to be consideration of post-launch of this product, because the diagnostic product does need to be successful, and it's really a partnership between the drug and the diagnostic company on some level to ensure that the diagnostic is successful and supports the launch of the drug. Should also point out, though, that these formal teams, while they're important to the program, there's also frequently a need for smaller, more informal discussions. For example, an alliance management discussion, just to make sure the communications are going effectively. In the event that there's more than one program going on, ensure that there's resource balancing and things like that across a different program, and make sure that on a corporate level there's alignment. And if any issues come up, then they need to be driven up to the joint executive committees or even higher to make sure that this stuff is being managed. Also, I think it's very important, while I strongly endorse having a one-company attitude in the development of a companion diagnostic, it's important that within each company there's separate discussions to ensure that that individual company's interests are being focused on and are being really fulfilled. Sometimes a larger program can directionally move off in a direction that makes sense to the larger group, but doesn't always make sense to the interests of, say, the pharma company or of the diagnostic company. So those discussions have to happen, and if issues are identified, then they need to come back to the broader teams. It's also important within each individual company, make sure that functionally people are following through, that there's effectiveness within that company, and to manage any issues that occur through those companies. But generally, any issues that are dealt with in these more informal groups really need to be pushed either to the working teams or up to the governance bodies to manage and to execute on anything that's identified. Okay. In addition to the formal teams that are identified usually contractually, it's important to know, to recognize that there's a lot of different smaller teams that maybe need to be created. They may be transient, but they're certainly needed during the development of the assay at various times. For example, there's always a need for a technical development team, which frequently is valuable to have input from the drug companies because they are very knowledgeable typically of the clinical data as well as the biomarker data as it relates to their drug. Regulatory teams are needed to create regulatory submissions, develop the strategy around those submissions, and make sure there's alignment between the drug diagnostic regulatory strategies. Execution of clinical studies usually requires a clinical team. There always should be and can never forget the importance of managing intellectual property. Assurances around freedom to operate for the drug are not necessarily the same as having freedom to operate for the diagnostic product. And of course, if any new IP is generated in the process, it needs to be filed on. Sometimes there's a need for a supply chain. Some diagnostic products require the actual drug in the development of the diagnostic product. So the pharma company needs to have a supply chain to deliver that, not just for the development process, but have a long-term strategy for developing or for delivering the raw materials to the diagnostic companies. I mentioned having commercial teams. Sometimes it's formally identified in the contracts. Sometimes it's less formal. And not infrequently, the commercial teams form very late in the process as you start moving towards regulatory submissions and commercialization. However, there may be a need for an informal team earlier on to make sure the commercial strategy is anticipated. And then finally, very few development programs are effective if they don't have good samples to develop and validate the diagnostic test on. And there may be a need to have a separate strategy or program to acquire samples for that development work. And this is a short list of ones that I put in here. Clearly, every program is unique, and teams should be created and shut down as is necessary for the program. I mentioned earlier the role of program management, and program management is very important to have an effective effectively executed project. It should tend not to take the center stage, but to support the activities of all these various teams. But clearly, project management has several activities that they are solely responsible for. One is to make sure that the strategic goals are developed and communicated, both for the program and on an annual basis or whatever periodic basis is necessary. They need to manage a schedule, both a high-level schedule so that it can be, managed at a corporate level, as well as a detailed schedule so the working teams can, manage their time on a more or less daily basis. Managing resources and managing costs for the program. It's critical to make sure that resources are available when they're needed, and when you're working with different companies with different priorities and multiple programs, sometimes resources become a challenge. So it's important that that's managed closely. And I list a few other things out here too. When there's a milestone that's being approached or completed, there needs to be alignment that that's been done, and there needs to be a sign-off more or less across the various organizations that the milestone's been achieved. Frequently there's a payment associated with these, but also there just needs to be consensus that it's ready to move on to the next stage of the program. Program managers need to ensure communication is effective. They tend to be the first level of issue management. And also, they can oversee how the program is communicated externally, whether that's through publications, working with key opinion leaders, managing relationships with consortia, or other sorts of, they're really the first stop for these other types of communications to the outside. And I think that brings me to the end of the discussion with regard to high-level approaches to managing the pharma diagnostic relationships. As I've talked about a lot in this discussion, one of the most important activities is making sure there's alignment between the goals of the pharma and the diagnostic companies. And this can be a significant challenge to come to alignment, but it's something that you need to stick with it and make sure that it does happen. The teams that manage these development programs are very complex, very, very highly matrixed. They can involve many more people than typically a diagnostic development program can manage. I've had a couple of programs where I've sat down and actually counted up the number of people who are participants in the program across the multiple companies that are involved, and it can actually end up north of 100 people. One program actually was closer to 150 people. That's a lot of people to manage their interests for the program, and so it requires very, very intense management to make sure that everything stays aligned. Having formal governance over the program is important. However, it's really the activities and the empowerment needs to be driven down to these smaller teams so that they can get the job done as effectively as possible. And some of the key success factors, as I've mentioned throughout, having alignment on common goals, communication, ensuring that there's a strong relationship of mutual respect between the different organizations, understanding that there's always going to be differences in priorities, difference in philosophies, difference in cultures, and work to make sure that that doesn't become a barrier to the program. You really just need to accommodate the differences, whether that's formally or informally, and a big factor in that is effective communication. And then, of course, no program that works well without having good execution, having a plan and executing a plan, and always maintaining a focus on the quality of the product that you're going to deliver, because that's really the bottom line here, is to deliver high-quality products that help treat patients better than they're being treated today. And with that, I will conclude, and I'm going to pass this back to Thomas to wrap things up and to start to accept some questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, George. We do, in fact, have a few questions here, so I will start off with the first. Let's see here. What recommendations would you offer to clinical diagnostic companies with new, flexible technologies to help find and develop research and/or CDX relationships with pharma companies?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And I've probably said this, if anybody's heard me speak before, I've said this before, but one of the challenges in the diagnostics field is that a diagnostic product has to be very, very effective, and it has to be accepted by both the regulatory bodies and the field that it's going to be reliable. So bringing a new technology in has been very, very challenging. If you look at the how long it's taken next generation sequencing to become a in vitro diagnostic product, it just happened today. As a matter of fact, if anybody hasn't seen it, there's an announcement that Illumina's next-gen platform was just approved. I think that's a real challenge for any new technology getting in. It takes years. I think the most effective way is to try to approach the drug companies through their business development organization. Hopefully you can identify the individuals or the organization that is that's working with the companion diagnostic programs and have an opportunity to present your technology to them. I know that at Bristol Myers Squibb we do probably 3 or 4 what we call capabilities assessments per month, where we talk to either very large diagnostic companies or smaller biotech companies about technologies that they have or capabilities that they have. And I think the best way to do it is just get in front of them and see if there's a opportunity for some collaborations. Frequently, those collaborations would start in the biomarker field, maybe in identification of biomarkers or the further evaluation of a biomarker that's been identified on a discovery platform, but not necessarily one that could go into the diagnostic field. I think that would be my recommendation, but I will say it is quite a challenge.
All right, our next question is, can you give us examples, real life, not hypothetical, of mission or scope creep in the context of CDX development? They're a little challenged there because, of course, not all information is public on this. I can give you one that I would say is somewhat public at this point. There has been publications about this. Many of you are probably familiar with the saga of KRAS and the EGFR inhibitors. And not too long ago, in mid-2012, BMS actually obtained an approval for the use of KRAS testing to identify patients who would benefit from colorectal cancer patients who benefit from treatment with Erbitux. There's a scope creep going on that one now because there's some recent publications around additional biomarkers in NRAS and perhaps BRAF that may have influence on the response to the EGFR inhibitors. And it's an interesting case because the KRAS model really does probably 90 to 95% effectively identifies patients who will respond or not to Erbitux. But there is that residual group of people who tend to be non-responders even though they are KRAS wild type. These NRAS mutations may compromise a very small percentage of the overall amount, but they may have value in testing. And I think there's discussion now as to whether or not those should be added in or just the medical community adopt them. And it's really not clear exactly how to move forward in that program. I can give another example without really describing the details, but within a program I'm working on, I was asked to develop a test for monitoring the levels of a drug. That development program moved along for about a year and a half very effectively, but over time actually we were incrementally asked to add additional companies into the program, and now that program has upwards of 5 different companies participating in the development of these diagnostics. Clearly that expanded the commitment on our side significantly from the original intentions. So I'm going to pass that back to you. Hopefully I did answer that. All right, let's see, next question. Where does the most tension usually come up in pharma DX partnerships? development, regulatory, commercialization, etc.?
That's a terrific question. I would say that the tension tends to be spread and is very program specific. I'm not sure I can give a direct answer to that. In some cases, actually, it's more business related. It tends to be around budget and costs. In some cases, and it's probably not infrequently, it's on the commercialization side as the diagnostic company realizes how long it's going to take to get the product onto the market because the drug approval cycle takes so long, or there's shifts in the clinical strategy and the target market tends to shrink. I think on the development side, my experience so far is that development teams, scientists tend to want to work well together, and the relationships on the technical level tend to be very effective. As they move out of that technical group into the operational aspect of it, tensions start to create again around maintaining schedules, maintaining costs, things like that. But it's all companion diagnostic programs, I mentioned this earlier, are very, very different so far. And so it's really, again, an issue of actively looking for where those tensions are starting to occur and managing them as they come along. Passing it back to you, Thomas.
Great, thank you. Next question. Can you speak more about how you evaluate different partnership considerations between DX manufacturers versus labs?
I'm not totally sure of that question. If I'm just going to reflect it back, and hopefully I'm answering it properly. But if the question is, how do we assess whether to go with a diagnostic manufacturer who would actually create a kit in a box that's commercially sold versus going to a laboratory that would develop a lab-developed test that may go through regulatory approvals like an LDT PMA? I think that assessment is based on the requirements for the drug. And if there's an expectation that the drug is going to be sold broadly, globally, having a single lab or a couple of labs is not as effective of a solution. If it's going to be a specialized product that's going to be in very limited geographies, maybe just the U.S., the LDT PMA approach is preferable. There's also cost considerations. I think, although it's not really panned out, there's not enough experience with it to say for certain, but certainly the LDT approach should be a less expensive approach to testing and also more effective when there's not as large of a target population to test. So I think there's a number of considerations that we look at, but we are open and we look at all of those possibilities for every program that we approach.
Thanks, George. That was my read of that question as well. So thank you for that answer. Next question. Can you speak about how you manage and align multiple CDX partnerships across your portfolio or for a single brand?
So BMS has clearly announced multiple relationships with multiple diagnostic companies. Sometimes the relationships are either therapeutic area specific or technology specific, but also at other times there's very broad relationships. And we've announced many master agreements that allow us to work with diagnostic companies in the development of pretty much anything that they have the technology to support. We like to work with our biomarker colleagues early in the development of biomarkers to identify what technologies are most appropriate for the biomarkers they're working with. And we tend to lean them towards companies where we have existing relationships, if at all possible. or companies where it seems like it would be a good thing for us to develop a broader relationship. And as we do that, then we may actually, in the ideal world, which I don't think anybody's achieved yet, but in the ideal world, for example, let's say we have a molecular diagnostic, a PCR test that we need. We might be able to approach 3 or 4 different companies that we have relationships with, say this is what we need. Does it fit in with your strategic priorities? Is it something you'd want to work on, and would you like to make a proposal for us to do this work? And we could actually get multiple, call them bids back for that work. Practically, there's not a lot of cases where that's actually going to happen, but in the ideal world, I think that's how we'd like to approach it.
All right. Next one is an actual compliment, I guess. First, thank you for such a structured and still mind-boggling talk, but two-part question here. How long does it typically take for CDX development? And 2, how much of that time is spent after the drug hits the market?
So interesting question, the second part particularly. So diagnostic development timelines are fairly well defined. I think that if it's run effectively, if a companion diagnostic program is run effectively, it should run on the same more or less schedule. For me, rule of thumb, I usually tell people that a lower technology assay, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but something like an immunohistochemistry, something like that, where it's not a lot of reagent development work, maybe would take anywhere between 2 to 3 to 4 years. A higher technology product, an immunoassay, a molecular diagnostic product, particularly if it's on a more complex platform, could take anywhere from 4 or 5 years. A big factor in that, if there's a existing product with existing critical raw materials developed, if you're starting with, say, a research use only product, you can shave a significant amount of time off of that. Also, if there is a platform that already has regulatory approvals, that tends to take time off the schedule as well. But in the end, the more highly complex things always seem to take 4 to 5 years, no matter what you seem to try to do, no matter how optimistic you try to be. The second part of the question, how much work occurs post-commercialization? The idealistic answer to that is should be none. I think in today's world, the development of diagnostic products has such rigid requirements to obtain an IVD approval that there should be very little left to question after the product has been approved and commercialized. There should be, issues in the, product issues, product failures, things like that. In my experience, that's on the decline since the QSRs have been put in place and such structure has been put around the development process. However, you always have to consider a possibility on the drug side that something new is learned about the treatment of patients or about the biomarkers' effectiveness. And if I go back to that KRAS example, certainly there's been some post-launch experience there. KRAS itself was a post-launch experience for the drug. Something that wasn't identified in clinical studies and was only really identified after additional work was done and the clinical studies were reevaluated. So I think generally that's my response to that question. It's a good question, though.
All right, and the last question is actually a comment and says, thanks for the great talk. So I'd certainly like to second that, George. Thank you very much for the great talk. Thanks to the attendees for some great questions. And with that,
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for listening as well. And I enjoyed the discussion and the questions.